Remembering Gary Matthews. Gary's death was very sudden, unexpected, and a tragic blow to all of us, and a great loss to QDN, a great loss to Queensland, and a great loss to Australia.
And the reason why all of us are here today, remembering a person who gave so much. He was so strong, such a good advocate, such a kind person, and he's left a legacy for QDN that is something that is very special.
He did take the opportunity to join us on the board and quickly became a very popular director, very passionate advocate, very fun character, always shared his opinion, which I love. I think that's a good sign of a strong and skilled and resilient advocate, to be fearless, someone I will admire and respect and always think of.
He was marvellous, he was wonderful. He took things on that he was completely incapable of doing and then found out that he could do them. He took on the Treasury and the compliance and auditing. What did he know about them? As he laughingly informed us, nothing! That never stopped Gary. He just launched straight into it and said, well, if I get it wrong, you'll tell me, won't you? And we did.
I was very lucky to have him as my deputy, and he was able to share a lot about his own life, his lived experience, things that happened to him. That to me was one of Gary's real key gifts, was his networking, his ability to share, and his ability to be kind and funny. And he wasn't scared to say what he thought.
I said once to him, you can never leave this committee. Your position is sort of unique. And he was a unique character, and that he spoke up on issues, which is really important for every board member and every person with a disability.
Gary and I would always bump into each other, and every time he would make time to sit and talk about things with me, give me feedback, give me advice. So my memory of Gary would be very generous and extremely genuine and real. You always knew where you stood with Gary.
I had the pleasure of serving on the board with Gary, and overwhelmingly for me, Gary was a gentleman and he was so welcoming. He created space for people to be heard.
Gary and I had the privilege of sharing a role on the QDN board at the same time, and for me, coming into that environment as a young director, first-time director, I was immensely grateful to Gary for always being respectful and thoughtful. And if I had to say a couple of words that I thought really summed him up, it was quite determination. You always knew that, he had an absolute massive heart for that community that he represented, and for the experiences that he'd had in striving for social justice, of trying to shift the dial and move things forward for rights with people with disability.
Gary was a person that I could have some very in-depth one-on-one conversations with. Gary helped me understand the importance of keeping our messages clear and straightforward and simple. It made me realize the importance of how we react and engage in the community, and we need to respond with the way we want people to treat us.
The Gary I know and remember so well is the Gary that in the very early days of QDN, when we were starting to roll out Ready to Go as a way of informing people about the NDIS. He and Peter Gurr especially used to travel a lot in central and north Queensland. And on some occasions, I can remember he, myself, and the delightful Michelle Moss being stuck in places that were not completely accessible, but on each of those occasions after we'd done workshops, we'd sit around talking about our lives. Gary was happy to share during those times that he had grown up in an institution. People may not know that. He was a person that understood what it was like to be removed from your family and placed in an institution for a long period of time.
Growing up at institution in Townsville where he lived. He really took on a role to look out for others, and I think that's probably where a lot of his foundations of advocacy started, because I think there were lots of experiences that weren't about choice and control in that environment, and Gary really took on that leadership role even back then to make sure that people were safe.
Yeah, he was a good bloke and he had a great sense of humour, shocker driver, and the most important thing about Gary, he was very quiet, but when an issue arose, he'd speak up and say exactly what he thought, and it was powerful.
And his passion for making a difference for people with disability stood out to me, because he was willing to often just say what had to be said and bring others along on that journey.
He was caring, but he was quite determined when he wanted something to happen. And he was definitely a person that was on about change.
Troy Wolski sent through a text message. He wanted to say that I learnt more in the couple of weeks that we travelled together for the regional and remote project about living with disability than I had in the 20 years of human service work previously. Honest, open and willing to discuss even the most taboo topics. Some examples that Troy gave were inspirational porn, UTIs, relationships and men's health, but that gave me a much broader understanding of the differences, but also the creative, clever and determined ways he would manage life. It was typical of Gary. He always gave himself to others, and for that I am grateful to have known him.
For me, Gary was like an onion. The more you peel back and the more you get to know Gary, he was such an intriguing person. I loved every single conversation that I had with him. And I always tried to push his limits and push him beyond where he needed to be, especially if I threw him in front of the media with 40 minutes notice. Yeah, no problem. Just tell me what I've got to do. What's the typical response of Gary? The trust, the respect and the enthusiasm that he would just get behind the issues that matter has left a complete imprint in my head.
I first met Gary in the Brisbane City Hall, and the first thing I noticed was a intelligent-looking man with a camera strapped around him. As an avid photographer myself, I made a beeline straight for Gary. What sort of camera do you have? And we launched into a wonderful discussion about f-stops and shutter speeds and all of the things that put people to sleep, except avid photographers.
He used to describe himself as what I call a boy from the bush. You know, a bit rough, a bit outspoken. However, within that so-called boy from the bush was the man that also was an artist, was a fantastic photographer, and was a great writer, actually writing poetry, and very good poetry.
I guess Gary is a lovable American, and that's what I want to remember about him. You know, he was an incredible flirt. He is just an amazing person and always had this way of making everyone feel very special and listened to. But I wanted to acknowledge that Gary also did amazing work in the housing space, and I often sought his counsel in that arena.
He had a big heart. He was a wonderful advocate, especially in his own community. He was very welcoming of people. He was very genuine.
As I lay me down to sleep, I hear her speak to me.
I had the opportunity of meeting Gary almost 2 years ago now. He was the first QDN member I met because he was on the interview panel for my employment starting at QDN, and everyone always talks about his sense of humour. No one's mentioned his gorgeous hair yet.
He probably wanted us all to mention his hair. because it certainly was very lovely.
And I too, as someone who's follically challenged, will mention his hair. For many of us as members and directors will know, he was often referred to as Cinderella.
As someone who had the pleasure of touching it on more than one occasion, I can say that it felt as good as it looked.
Gary will be immensely missed, and I certainly have to say for myself that I had immense respect for the person and advocate that he was.
I'll always be very grateful to Gary and for lighting that fire, I suppose, with me when it comes to the disability sector. He'll always have a very special place in my heart.
No, he was a terrific person to have around, and he'd be greatly missed.
And he always was quick to make sure that things that didn't need to be taken too seriously weren't. And so that was another gift.
I shall always remember our conversations. And, he was a true advocate. Gary was a fighter. And he's left a big hole for us to fill.
What I will hold on to is those memories of that generosity and that mentorship. So let's just continue as Gary would have wanted us all to do. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. And that's something we can all try and measure up to.
He was absolutely passionate about his community, passionate about housing, and I will always remember his expertise and contribution to QDN.
That leadership and that influence that he had really was something that he brought to QDN that we need to celebrate, and we need to make sure that we all live those ideals that he lived before he left us.
His wonderful humour, his wonderful humility, his artistry, his photography, and just the incredible human being he was, and what he was able to contribute to changing the lives of people with disability, but also his broader community.
Let's all remember Gary as a good-humoured, good photographer. He had a heart for people.
And we will miss you dearly.
You keep